Uh, even now, my microphone's not working right. Hopefully, you can all hear me over the microphone, but I've been having technical issues all day that have disturbed some of my videos and also kept me from logging on until just now. So we are starting late, but better late than never, I suppose. And we are going to be bringing you some friendly neighborhood history commentary, questions, and answers for the next hour or so, as we do every Friday and Saturday, usually at 4 p.m. Pacific time on Saturdays, but now it's 7:40 on the East Coast, so we're behind. But we'll be going for the next hour or so, talking about answering any of your questions, topics, comments about social studies, geopolitics, past and present, humanities, and history. That's what we do here. Geography. Every Friday and Saturday night, we do our typical live stream where we answer any questions you may have about social studies and history. And we used to only do it once a weekend, but people really wanted twice a weekend, so we moved up, and then I decided to add a live stream lecture. Um, and that is why we have Fridays and Saturdays and now Sundays. So there are 3 back-to-back-to-back live streams every weekend that hopefully you can all join us for. We have Friday night. We had a nice discussion last night, some answers to questions and stuff like that. And then, of course, today we have our usual second part of the live stream Q&A on Saturdays, and Friday. And then on tomorrow, we will be doing a live stream lecture. I still haven't decided which topic exactly I'm going to do. Somebody mentioned yesterday that I should do the French Revolution for our live stream lecture, which I'm hoping one day will become the Friendly Neighborhood History Podcast. But the problem with that is I've already done a live stream lecture quite some time ago about the French Revolution, which is really interesting. And so I'm not quite sure exactly what I'm going to be lecturing on tomorrow. I could lecture about the history of Hanukkah, as we're in the midst of the holiday season, and Hanukkah lasts for 8 nights while Christmas lasts for 12. And Hanukkah started on Christmas night, technically speaking, but I've talked a lot about that. I have a video about the history of Hanukkah, so I'm not sure. Maybe I'll do multiple different topics, including that. Not sure. Maybe I'll just do a surprise live stream lecture about what I'm thinking about, feeling, and thinking about that morning, or something along those lines. But if you enjoy what we do here at the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel, where we bring you hopefully quality content concerning history, we answer your questions, and you enjoy these Q&As and the topics we discuss, please consider liking and subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. I don't know if we're going to be able to hit our goal of 6,000, a legion of friendly neighborhood historians by the end of the year, but we are growing, and we really appreciate everybody who likes and subscribes and joins the friendly neighbor. And becoming a friendly neighborhood historian is as easy as liking and subscribing. And so for the next hour or so, whatever topics you would like, whatever comments or questions you have about history or social studies, drop them in the chat and I'll be happy to answer them. That's what we do here. We always love giving back to our fans, because throughout the week, hopefully you're enjoying and watching the short form and long form content that I'm creating, and enjoying all the history that I'm talking about. And so the weekends are a time when I give back to you by answering your questions, your queries, and I not only am sharing my historical knowledge but with you, but also imparting it, getting historical knowledge. I've been corrected on a bunch of different things. People have brought up topics I didn't know about that I researched and learned about more, and developed a more cohesive, deeper understanding of history because of that. And my historical knowledge has grown thanks to this wonderful community of people who really are enthusiasts for history, known as the Friendly Neighborhood Historians. And again, to become a Friendly Neighborhood Historian, all you have to do is like and subscribe. I apologize for the late start we're having, but we've had some issues with technology today, so we're getting a rather late start. Um, but we are going to be going for the next hour. Make sure to show some love to my wonderful moderator, Simon the Bunny, who has put the social media handles in the chat. So if you want to follow me on social media and keep updated with what we're doing, we have social media handles. We have a Substack now. You can follow me on Instagram or X or Facebook, or read the Substack blog. I didn't make a blog yesterday, but I'm planning to make one today. But yeah, really enjoy that. And so I'm going to be going through the chat and answering whatever questions, comments, or topics you would like to bring up and talk about related to history and social studies. And Simon, I see, was holding on the chat. Thank you so much, Simon. I can't do it without you. Um, yeah. Uh, yeah. Sorry about the delay. Sorry about how late we started, C-Dub. I hope you're still here. Um, well, I was hoping he is agreeing with my request to speak tonight on the French Revolution, but no exact questions at the moment other than the topic. Well, C-Dub, I really love talking about the French Revolution. If you have anything specific you want to ask regarding the French Revolution, I'd be happy to oblige and talk about it, because we've talked about that on the channel a lot. I've got several videos on it, and I did my live stream lecture on it. It's a lot of fun. Um, yeah. Let's see here. I do love learning about the French Revolution. Maybe I'll just do that because there's just so much. There's a lot of fun there, and the French Revolution lasts for about 30 years. And there's not just one French Revolution. There's like five of them that happened in the 19th century, so it's a lot of fun. Um, Yeah, and today is the official opening of Westminster Abbey, and if you like learning about what happened on this day in history, check out my series of those. I do a video every day about what happened on this day in history, and today there was a bunch happening in history. I also do historical birthdays, who was born on this day. Today is the birthday of President Woodrow Wilson, the 27th president of the United States, who navigated the country through World War I, created the League of Nations, and set up a Federal Reserve System. I also do who died today in history, and we see, and today is the anniversary of the passing of Queen Mary II of England, who helped establish a constitutional monarchy in England in the late 17th century, and it's also the anniversary of the passing of Rob Roy, the famous Scottish rebel who resisted English incursions into Scotland in the late 17th and early 18th century. Um, Yep. So this is the anniversary of when the Westminster Abbey, the seat of the Archbishop of Canterbury, the most important prelate in the English Church, was officially opened, and it has become the most important church in all of England, if not one of the most important churches in all of the world. Many kings and monarchs have been crowned there. It remains a place for royal weddings and royal celebrations. I believe Harry and Meghan, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle were married there. The Duke and Duchess of Kent of York, which in the line of English succession, the heir to the English throne is known as the Prince of Wales because in the 1260s, Edward, the heir to the English throne, conquered the country of Wales and his father, Henry III, determined that he was the Prince of Wales, and therefore the heir to the English throne has always been known as the Prince or Princess of Wales. And because the House of York has been so important, and it's the second most important city in England, and I'm not referring to Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. I'm referring to England proper. The Duke or Duchess of York has always been second in line to the throne. So Prince William is the Prince of Wales now, with Charles III being the new monarch in England. And Harry, although he has refrained from embracing many of his royal titles and privileges, is technically the Duke of York. He is second in line to the English throne. So let me see here. So there's an Archbishop of Canterbury crisis going on right now. That's quite interesting. Justin Welby is resigning amid a crisis following his resignation. Most Reverend. Interesting. So again, you have the Archbishop of York rising to that position, Simon, because you have the development. You have York being the second most important place, the second most important bishopric, as well as the second most important title and land in England. And that's going to be on January 6th at Epiphany at the end of the 12 days of Christmas. Carol, thank you so much. Welcome. Nazir Salam. So good to see you. Noah, I hope you're still here. Great to see you. Uh, Yes, Simon, I would definitely recommend Ken Burns' Civil War. It's really enjoyable. It's basically changed the way that we have made history documentaries with the frame moving up and down, which is called Ken Burns, literally named after him. That style of framework for pictures and paintings and depictions and artwork in documentaries. It is extraordinarily long. It's copious. It's detailed. It's not exhaustive because I don't think a history of such an important conflict like the Civil War could necessarily be exhaustive, but I would definitely recommend the Civil War from Ken Burns as one of the most important documentaries, something everybody should watch. Um, what do you think about what Ukrainian citizens did to Polish? When are you referring to? Specifically. Mike, great to see you. Magnus, also good to see you. It's always great to have our friendly neighborhood historians here. And to become a friendly neighborhood historian, it's as easy as liking and subscribing. And you are officially a friendly neighborhood historian. You don't have to get out your credit card. You don't have to give me your mother's maiden name and social security number. Liking and subscribing, coming to our live streams, enjoying the short and long form content we produce here on the channel every day. That's how you become a friendly neighborhood historian. It's that easy. My goal is to set up a Discord or WhatsApp where we can communicate with each other in a more in kind of more of a group chat way and just have continual conversations. Should be a lot of fun. Hello, Freshly. It's great to see you. Great to have you here. So I'm not technically the friendly neighborhood historian. You guys are technically the friendly neighborhood historians because my channel exists to serve and help and inform and educate everybody who comes into contact with us. And that's what we tend to do. And I have been educated by a lot of people who have brought their knowledge and wisdom about certain historical events that I don't know about to have brought that to the table, while I also share as much knowledge as I possibly can here in the live streams and on our short and long form videos. So Magnus is here, Carol is here. It's all great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us this Saturday evening. I know that you might have plans and some of you want to go out and party, but before you go out and party and enjoy your Saturday evenings, uh, enjoy some history. And yes, of course, always great to see you. So, Carol, I don't know exactly what you mean about what Ukrainian citizens did to the Polish. I'm not sure when that exactly happened. There has been a lot of interplay. Poland, actually, in the 17th century, during the 1600s, was the predominant power in Eastern Europe, more so than Russia or Ukraine or any of these areas. And the Ukraine, which is where the Kievan Rus, which are the Russian people, see their ancestral start, was actually the more predominant land than Russia itself proper throughout the early centuries of the Slavic and Vikings that intermarried to become the Russian people. I'm talking about 1000, 1100. Most of the people in who we would consider to be Russian were actually in Kiev and in Ukraine, and Ukraine was the major power in Eastern Europe at that time. So, really interesting stuff. Um, Ukraine it has been part of Russia. You can argue that Russia starts in Ukraine, but there have been distinctive times when Ukraine has been independent of Russia. But starting in 1657, under the conquest of Tsar Alexis, the land became assimilated by the Russians and was split by the Polish. And when the Russians took over Poland in the 1700s, splitting it with the Germans and the Austrians and the Prussians, the Ukraine actually became fully controlled by the Russians and has been part of the Russian sphere of influence and hegemony ever since then, um, but has become more. But obviously, in the last 30 years, has gained its independence and now sees that independence and autonomy that came out of the end of the Cold War challenged by the incursions of Russian nationalism under the leadership of Vladimir Putin. So there's actually a 1,000-long-year history of Russia and Ukraine interplaying with each other, and Ukraine having independence and autonomy, and Russia being separate from Ukraine or being in control of Ukraine. And this back and forth has led to the demand for Ukraine to be returned to the Russians under Putin. So Putin is making a historical argument, and that's what I've talked about in the channel before. We talked about this yesterday. In order to understand the way things are now in the world, we need to understand the history behind them. So, um, yeah, we don't know if there's going to be a partitioning of Ukraine. Nobody knows exactly what there's going to be happening. One thing that Putin has mentioned recently is that he is open to ending the war in Ukraine as long as there is a new political election and maybe the end of Volodymyr Zelensky as the president of the Ukraine. So we'll see exactly what happens there. I'm not sure, Raj. It's an interesting and difficult situation, and no one is going to be able to solve it easily. It might be a partitioning of a land. There might be a loss of Ukrainian land. Putin has made several incursions into this area before and uh, has taken over certain parts of land, Crimea, eastern Ukraine, the Donbass region, and now he is claiming it's a continual claim. It's the same claim the Nazi Germans made under Hitler in the 1930s in the Sudetenland in western Czechoslovakia. And the claim made by the Russians is that a significant portion of Ukraine is actually Russian and is based on the Russians. So I don't think the Ukrainians are getting the Crimea back anytime, Drasha. So I expect the Russians to hold on to Ukraine for the foreseeable future, or at least to hold on to the Crimea. And who knows how much of the Ukraine they'll get from this war. This war doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon. Continual military spending and involvement by Europe and the United States has not crushed the Russians. The Russians have brought in their own allies, like the North Koreans, who really haven't done much in the war, but have been formidable in the sense that they've been a danger to the entire world, because there's this idea now that you have a bunch of different countries willing to come and help the Russians destroy the Ukrainians and things like that. So we don't know exactly what's going to happen with the end of the war, and we don't know exactly what's going to happen next. It's kind of all over the place, and history is unpredictable. We've seen this time and time before. We had no idea that Ukraine would become its own independent country. We had no idea that the Cold War would end. Historians of the people growing up of that generation of the 1970s and 80s who came of age in that time did not believe that they would ever see the fall of the Berlin Wall. And yet by the end of the 1980s, the Berlin Wall was fallen, Germany was reunited, and the Cold War was well on its way to ending. So We don't know exactly what's going to happen. Maybe an autonomous Ukraine is something that's only going to last for a certain amount of time, and then it's going to become part of Russia again, because that has happened several times throughout its history, where it seems to have gained some level of autonomy, only for the Russians in particular to come back and quell them and take them back over. So we have no idea if that's going to happen or not. Um, but yeah, so um, we also I didn't know that Zelensky was supposedly a comedian. I did not know that. Was he supposedly a comedian? I know, I mean, he has a certain level of appeal and entertainment value. He doesn't dress very formally. He comes off very casually. He has a certain gravitas about him, and people like him because he really strikes the underdog note very well, because of how small Ukraine is in proximity to Russia and how intimidating Russia is, mainly because of its size, not because its military or economy is particularly that great. In fact, one of the reasons that this war began was Putin was trying to stabilize the Russian economy when it was extraordinarily weak. So, um, yeah, we don't know exactly what's going to happen next. Um, yeah, who will join NATO next? That's a good question. I think that interesting, Raja. So that actually is true and quite fascinating. I don't know if NATO is saturated. I think there's an anti-NATO movement, especially in the United States. The neo-isolationist wing is gaining more and more power and more influence, and I think because of that, there will be more and more. Um, it'll be harder and harder for countries to join NATO. There'll be less support for NATO, and there's less reason for NATO. And one of the arguments made by the neo-isolationist wing is that NATO is not necessary anymore, and that basically NATO was used as a Cold War weapon against the Soviets to create a coalition of support. And now it just seems superfluous to continually add countries to NATO, that there is no purpose for NATO to even exist anymore or to receive funding from the United States. So if that neo-isolationist wing, which seems to be particularly popular with President Trump, really gains more and more influence, then we could see NATO in a state of serious decline and countries really not joining it. Bosnia might be the next one. We don't exactly know. Um, I don't know how much longer NATO is going to continue to be a huge geopolitical force in Europe, especially if the Russians do win this war, or at least gain a significant portion of Ukrainian land, because that means Ukraine will not join NATO anytime soon. And it will show that NATO was ineffective at stopping the Russian threat. So I think NATO is at stake in some ways with this war as well. Um, Yeah, I don't think it can be taken seriously, especially after how the war has gone now, Raja. I think the war has really resulted in the Russians showing weaknesses within the NATO system, and their continual onslaught of Ukraine has basically said if anybody tries to put Ukraine under a supranational front, be it the EU or NATO, they will pay with heavy consequences. And I think that's a huge. It's been a huge problem for the Russians, for the Europeans who are trying to strengthen the appeal of NATO. Also, you have Britain leaving the EU and the whole Brexit thing, which I think that was a chink in the armor of the EU and showed that people don't have to go along with the EU program. And I think that NATO is now seeing that with this Ukrainian war. So supranationalism, which became very popular after the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, has kind of received a backlash in the last few years. In the last decade, there's kind of been this backlash against supranationalism, against globalization, against creating a basically an organization that runs a continent, which is what the EU would do if it could, but it doesn't seem to have that ability or power anymore. And the fascinating thing about Brexit, Raja, is that yeah, the fascinating thing about Brexit is that it adds another layer and issue surrounding the whole thing of, is Britain part of Europe? Because Britain is technically considered European, obviously, but if you study its history, especially ever since the Napoleonic Wars and even before then, Britain does not see itself necessarily as European the same way the French, Germans, and Italians do. In fact, basically, the British want to focus on empire building all throughout the 19th century and leave Europe to itself and leave it to its own functionings. And maybe that is what Brexit is. It's Britain returning to their own kind of isolationism, where as an island nation, they aren't as focused or dependent on NATO and the EU, and they aren't as interested in creating an international coalition of Europe, of where one government can run Europe, basically. And Britain has struggled with this identity back and forth throughout the centuries. I would argue that ever since the Norman conquest in 1066, the British have been going back and forth um, with this whole identity of, are they European? How European are they? And are they European in the same way the French and the Germans and the Italians and the Spanish are? And it's an identity dynamic that the British have gone back and forth with, and sometimes they have really wanted to press into that. That's why they, in the 1300s, King Edward III designated himself as the King of France, and monarchs continued to do this until the 1700s. Um, and because the British have gone back and forth between being interested in continental affairs as opposed to international affairs, especially through the use of their robust navy, the British have not always been as European as France or Germany, or at least not as interested in European affairs. It's not a condemnation at all, but I think that it's just a national identity thing for the British people, and I think it's really, really interesting. So yeah, and Simon, I don't think it's not a bad thing about the British at all. I think it's quite fascinating, and it makes their history for me, as I study British history, a little bit more unique than the history of the rest of Europe, because European affairs at times have not been as important to the British. The Avignon papacy, the Babylon captivity of the Catholic Church, the schism between the Catholics and the Orthodox have not had as huge of an impact on England as it did on France, the Holy Roman Empire, or Italy. Which the Holy Roman Empire, for those of you who don't know, is basically what Germany and several other countries were in the Middle Ages. The English and the British have been far more. What was far more important to the British during the English during the Middle Ages was the conquest of the rest of the island, be it Wales, and then Scotland, and then Ireland, and the subjugation of those people. After the fall of Napoleon, it was the subjugation of India. It was the building of an empire in Africa. It was trying to connect Johannesburg in South Africa with Cairo through a railroad. It was these sorts of things, these empire building, that the British really love. And because they're an island nation, they relied on a very strong navy that has been formidable for centuries to basically buoy their international interests and endeavors. And so, because of that, the European affairs haven't mattered as much to them. There's only been one English pope, as opposed to dozens of French, hundreds of Italian, or dozens of French and Italian popes. Um, the English did not participate in the Crusades nearly as much, which was formative for Western Europe. And the Industrial Revolution started in England before it started in other parts of Europe, because their economy was based on textiles, because they're in the north and they're far colder. So clothing and the mass production of clothing was far more important to the British. So there's a lot of differences fundamentally and in identity between the British and the rest of Europe. However, they are still very much European, especially if you look at it from an American lens. Um, Yes, Raja. I use British and English independently, because the name of the island that the Romans gave it was Britannia, and that referred to the entire island. But the Brit or and the Britons were the name of the barbarian tribe, the Celtic barbarian tribe that the Romans fought against. But there was obviously Caledonia in the north, which is Scotland, and there was Wales, which is where all of the Latin Roman-based peoples fled in the late 5th century when the Romans left the island, and that is why the Welsh consider themselves a distinct people from the English. Um, Basically, you could say that the story of England in the Middle Ages is, how European is it? And once it lost most of the land it had controlled in France, it became far more interested in controlling its own island, and then Ireland, and then after that, building an empire. So Britain, when I refer to Britain, I am referring to England as the primary and most formidable force on that island, with no offense whatsoever to the Scottish or to the Welsh. Um, Yeah, Henry VIII had a big impact. In fact, something that people don't know about Henry VIII is that Henry VIII is actually the one who created the English Navy because he wanted to defeat the French. And so he actually laid the foundations for the English Navy becoming as powerful as it was. And it was that powerful Navy that allowed them to ensure and build an empire all over the world and be far more interested with things like Canada, the 13 colonies in the United States, Australia, and India than with European inner continental affairs, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries. Um, Running Man, good to see you. Always glad to have you here. Yeah, there's only been one Polish pope, and that was John Paul II, one of the most famous popes. Um, that's true. So you always have that border between Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland and all that. Do you think America speaking English makes the UK more powerful in Europe? I think that because the lingua franca of the world has become American, because the US dollar is so strong, I think that England has kind of relied, especially since World War II, has relied on the president, on its, on America being an Anglo-based nation, mainly populated by WASP people, especially early on, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, who continue to speak English and carry on English practices and customs. Of course, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, these are all ideas that the Americans got from the British parliamentary system. And I think the influence and the common heritage and political identity between the British and the Americans have allowed the Americans to basically um, be this offshoot of the British who increased their prestige and influence in Europe because of the might of the American military that was on full display in World War II. Um, and I think that yes, there is a little bit of a back and forth there, Simon, because I believe in many ways America does reflect how powerful the British actually were and how deep their influence was. Because even after the United States got its independence from Great Britain, it still carried on many of the practices. It still spoke the same language. It still carried the same name, and it still created a political system with a constitution and a Bill of Rights. And the oldest ally of the United States has been the English. And it hasn't always been smooth. You have the War of 1812. The United States almost went to war with Great Britain in the 1840s over the Oregon Territory in the Pacific Northwest. But there, starting in the middle of the 19th century, there was this shared commonality of values and ideals that tied the British and the Americans together and eventually helped lead America into World War I and then again World War II on the side of the British because they spoke the same language, they had the same heritage, and you can't tell American history without telling the history of the British Empire. So, and yes, so one way to distinguish it is England is the largest political entity on the island of Britain. Great Britain is England, Wales, and Scotland. Then there is the United Kingdom, which is England, Wales, Scotland, the Isle of Man, and Northern Ireland that still is loyal to England. And so that has been so there's England, which is a distinct entity from Scotland and Wales and Ireland and Northern Ireland and Ireland, Southern Ireland, obviously, and the Isle of Man. Then there's Great Britain, which was formed when England and Scotland united in the Act of Union of 1707. Then there's Northern Ireland, which and the Isle of Man, which are called the part of the UK, the United Kingdom. So, um, but anyways, Henry VIII also wed Anne Boleyn to get away from Catholicism. I've been reading a really great book about that by what's her name again? Lucy Wooding about Tudor England. It's really, really good. And she discusses how Henry VIII basically just isolated everybody. He couldn't keep he secretly continued to practice Catholicism, but he condemned the authority of the papacy because he wanted his own authority and his own power to be there. And he wanted to amass wealth for himself by divesting the monasteries and condemning them as corrupt. So in that way, he allied with the Protestants. But at the same time, he condemned Lutheranism, Luther's teachings, the five solas, the authority of the Bible alone, which was common to Protestant ideas. And he burned Protestants at the stake for refusing to acknowledge the transubstantiation, which is a Catholic doctrine that basically says that the bread and wine of communion is the literal body and blood of Christ. So Henry VIII was conflicted between his political appearance as the head of the church, which is what he asserted when he left the Catholic Church, and he was conflicted between that and his hatred of Protestant theology because he had created a Protestant church without believing in any of the Protestant doctrines. At the same time, he left the Catholic Church not just so that he could obtain a divorce and marry Anne Boleyn, who was a far more staunch Protestant than he was, as were many of the church members. But at the same time, he also left the church so that he could amass wealth and power for himself by stripping away the monasteries and seizing their assets. And he also wanted to make a show to declare that England was powerful. And once again, dealing with this identity of having France and the Holy Roman Empire being the two major powers in Europe. And how does he relate to the continental affairs of Europe? Well, he declared England was an empire. And because it was an empire, he was in charge of the religious life in his realm. And he also asserted himself as being the Lord of Ireland and the King of France. And these were titles the English kings used for centuries to come. So Henry VIII really did everything in his power to um, assert his dominance over the church. And so, in a way, the Henrician Reformation, or the English Reformation, it is called, at least under Henry VIII, is not about getting away from Catholic doctrines and ideas. It's about political authority being vested in the king, even over the church. And so, the idea that God put the king there is replaced by the idea that the king put God there, which is quite precarious for Catholics and Protestants alike, but is exactly how Henry VIII wanted to think about it. Although at the same time, a man full of paradoxes as he was, and he's a fascinating character. The first big video I ever made that broke through and got thousands and thousands of views was about Henry VIII and his marriages. But at the same time, Henry wanted to believe that he was a godly knight and Christian king, and that he was a chivalrous humanist who believed very deeply in his faith. And to some extent, that is true, but he also used his faith as a way to gain power. So, um, yes, that is correct, CW. And we do use them interchangeably. So I've gotten a lot of criticism for referring to all of that area as England, when I'm only referring to England as the predominant political power on the islands, as it has been for 1,000 years. In fact, ever since the Norman conquest, England has been considered Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, to a large extent, even before they were politically controlled by the English, have sworn loyalty and fealty to English as and have been in their sphere of influence. And many of the wars that happened in Scotland at the time of Braveheart and the story of William Wallace happened because the Scottish refused to um, swear loyalty, so the English used that as a pretense to capture more land and power. Um, yeah. Uh, the French had better food than the British. Everybody does. Yes, British food is not the most beloved food in the world, and I love so many things about French culture, including their cuisine. Um, do you think the whole town twinning is BS? I see the signs everywhere. I don't know what you mean by that, Simon. Which town? Do you think Scotland will be independent one day? I think that there's obviously a strong independence movement, but I don't see it happening. I think that there is the reason Scotland and England became one entity in 1707 was fascinating. For a century, ever since the death of Queen Elizabeth, when her cousin James became not only the king of England, but the king of Scotland, but the king of England, the realms had been ruled as two separate political entities ruled by the same person. So James I, Charles I, Charles II, James II, William III, and Mary II had all been rulers of both England and Scotland. And then you get to Queen Anne, and Queen Anne oversaw the Scottish creating a series of different colonies in what is now Panama, called New Caledonia, and Nova Scotia, obviously, which is New Scotland in Canada. All of these colonies failed miserably and bankrupted the country, so the Scottish actually appealed to the English to bail them out, and the exchange was agreed upon by Parliament was that Scotland would be united as part under England, and the two would become one country. And this is where you get the formation of the red and white flag of England mixed with the blue and white flag of Scotland to become the Union Jack, which will later get another line in it from the Irish. But 1707, the Act of Union, brings them together as one entity because the Scottish need the English to bail them out financially. At the same time, the Scottish and the at the same time, that continues to be the issue. As long as Scotland relies on the English economy to help them, I think they will continue to be a part of England. I don't know that they'll become independent. Um, yes, the French did own Vermont and Maine, and large swathes of Canada. Jersey, Channel Island. I don't know. Never. I'm not sure if that's true. Triglyceride and interesting stuff. Um, Rodolfo, what is the Holy Roman Empire? So, to quote Voltaire, it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. The Holy Roman Empire is a fascinating, complex topic, and I've talked about it on several videos here on the channel. But basically, the Holy Roman Empire was most historians believe founded in 800 on Christmas Day when Charlemagne, who was the king of the Franks, who had built a huge empire that covered all of France, all of Germany, all the way into Austria and Czechoslovakia, as well as northern Italy, had been protecting the Pope as his main defender for decades now, and the Pope rewarded him by crowning him the King of the Romans, the first ruler of the Romans, the first real king of that land in 3 centuries since the fall of Rome. And basically, this connected Charlemagne and his bloodline with the Pope. And when Charlemagne died, he split his realm between his 3 sons. And one of his sons took over the land that is now mainly Germany. It also included the Netherlands, Bohemia, which is now Czechoslovakia, and Austria. And that land over time was melded and became known as the Holy Roman Empire. There's been a debate between whether it was a man named Otto in the 10th century or it was Charlemagne who actually was the first Holy Roman Emperor. But basically, um, it was holy in the fact that it was connected to the Catholic Church, and the Church had this direct connection, and that only the Pope could crown the Holy Roman Emperor, and he was the only emperor in Europe. And at first, the emperor held huge sway over Germany and Bohemia and all of these areas in Central Europe, and basically was in control of all of this. But as time went on, and these monarchs became more and more defiant of the church, eventually their power was mitigated, so that by the time the Renaissance begins, the Holy Roman Emperor was an elected position. Basically, the different counties and provinces in Germany would have an elector who would vote on who the Holy Roman Emperor would be. So it became an office to fill. It wasn't hereditary anymore, and they would basically vote on it, and that took away a lot of his power. So he wasn't an emperor in the sense that he controlled everything like a Roman emperor was. And by that time, they were mainly German and not Roman, because for centuries they had had nothing to do with actual Italy itself, but the Pope still had to officially approve them. So by the time Napoleon gets around, the Holy Roman Empire is a shell of its former self. Its emperors have no power, and it really doesn't have. It only has formal connections to the papacy. So Napoleon thinks that it's worthless and dissolves it because it's so fractured and so weak. So it's actually a story where it started off with a lot of impressive power. It started off being Holy Roman and an empire, but eventually became weaker and weaker and more dependent on the emperors really relied on those electors and princes to back them up, or else they would not have real authority. So the Holy Roman Emperor really didn't have that much power. In fact, you could argue it's one of the first examples of a figurehead in Europe, especially when you get to the 1500s, 1600s, and onwards. So, Rodolfo, hopefully that explains a little bit about what it's far more complex than that, but that's basically my quick summation of it. Yeah, Raja, I wouldn't say that Henry VIII failed miserably, again, in the way he wasn't as successful as Henry V. The changing political and economic dynamics of the time meant that England could not reconquer France like they had under Henry V in the 1400s. Henry VIII got really far in what he was trying to do in taking care of the French, but he was extraordinarily powerful and far more influential in European affairs than his father had been, but he wasn't in a position to override the French and take huge swathes of land back from them. After the Hundred Years' War, France basically was fully autonomous and strong enough that it could resist any incursions from the English from then on. So, um, where towns or cities in one country establish a formal partnership of a town or city in another country, this practice was introduced after World War II. Yeah, I'm not sure a lot about town twinning, but I've heard about it before. Hold on a second. Sorry about that. So I don't know an awful lot about it, but it is a way to promote cultural exchange and things like that. I mean, I've heard about things like this, but I don't know how formally the system works, so I'd have to actually do some more research on it, Simon, before I would know how town twinning actually comes about. Um, yeah, I don't know about that, Raja. I think that obviously Henry VIII has become the most famous king because of his brutality. But if you actually look at his reign in two parts, the first 20 years of his reign were extraordinarily successful. And he promoted learning and the development of culture. Humanism flourished in England. England became very wealthy and strong. I think he had shown himself to be a regal king, a very, very formidable on the battlefield. And of course, he created the Royal Navy. The second half of his reign, he was so obsessed with the succession crisis because he was so insecure about his own position as king that he makes a bunch of different and erratic decisions to grab power and consolidate his realm and his control, that he basically is unrecognizable from the second half of his reign to the first half of his reign. So the first half of Henry VIII's reign is actually one of the most successful in English history. The second half is extraordinarily erratic, unpredictable, and unpopular. And that's where you get a lot of the violence. That's where you get the murder of people basically at will. You get trumped up charges leading to the deaths of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, two of his wives who are murdered. Um, you have one minister being thrown out after another. You have More, Wolsey, and Cromwell suffering because of Henry VIII's capriciousness. But it's not as capricious as it looks. It's actually a way for him to hold on to as much power as he possibly can and dominate as much as he possibly can. Um, yeah, that's interesting, Simon. So you can have these weird connections all over the world. I can definitely see that happening. Um, so C-Dub, Ottomans, Franks, and barbarians, was that all the same peoples, and is that all generally what is Germany today? No. Good question, C-Dub, but no. The Ottomans were a Turkic tribe of there are many different Turkic tribes, but led by a man named Osman, and his people were the ones who were successfully able to conquer all of Turkey and then conquer the Middle East and destroy the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople in 1453. And they established a Muslim empire known as a caliphate, which controlled large portions of the Middle East, Turkey, and southeastern Europe, called the Balkans, for basically 5 centuries. And they were the most powerful Muslim empire, perhaps in history. And so they were Turkish, they were Muslim. The Franks were French barbarians that fought against the Romans, that eventually became the most powerful group of non-Romans to take over what had been called Gaul. And because the king of the Franks, Clovis, converted to Christianity once again on Christmas Day in 495, the Frankish kings were able to exert the most hegemony over the former Roman province of Gaul, making that region known as France. So the Franks are a particular barbarian group that take over what is now France, while the Ottomans are Turks who take over what is now Turkey. And there are different types of barbarian tribes. They're called barbarians because they made sounds like bar, bar, bar. They are not unsophisticated. They are not always savages who knew nothing or they were culturally diverse people with different languages and practices, who often warred and fought against each other and did everything they could to undermine the Romans. Sometimes they even fought for the Romans or were given land in the Roman Empire as long as they wouldn't fight against the Romans. So they had complex relationships with each other and with the Roman Empire. And the Franks were just a later barbarian tribe that emerged in Gaul that became the most powerful and was able to create a stable kingdom known as the Kingdom of France. So, um, yeah. Western Russian. That's really interesting. Well, Western Russian, there are different types of Russian peoples, and they are usually called White Russians. And these are the Russians who are considered to be more European, and they are born west of the Ural Mountains. And the Ural Mountains are considered the edge of Russia. So the major cities in Russia, like Moscow and St. Petersburg, are in Europe, technically speaking. But the vast majority of the land of Russia is actually in northern Asia. And so that is why Russia, much like England, but even more so, has struggled with this whole question of, is it Europe or is it not Europe? And the answer is, it is not Europe and it is Europe. But basically, Western Russians are people who, um, the Russian people were originally created through the intermarrying of the Slavs with Viking raiders known as the Rus in what is now Ukraine and Western Russia. And so that is the development of the Russian people, but that has also included uh, Nordic peoples, the Baltic states like Lithuania and Latvia and those groups of people being intermarried with the Russians. It has included Turkic groups that have been conquered by the Russians, such as the Tatars, who were Mongols, and has been the incorporation of local peoples in Siberia and in Central Russia and for all over these places, basically. So Western Russians are typically referred to as White Russians, and they are considered more European than other groups of Russian people. Um, yeah. So, um, it's okay, Simon. We'll miss you tomorrow, but we can hold down the fort. And thank you, Rodolfo, for agreeing to moderate. I appreciate you guys. Why is triglyceride? Why is Elon Musk subsidizing fascists in the Reform Party? Well, the British Reform Party seems to be a right. So something that Americans do not understand about politics is how far more liberal politics is in Canada and especially in Europe compared to the United States. The Democratic Party in the United States would be a center left party in Europe and maybe even more of a centered party. Well, American Republicans, who are considered far more conservative than the conservative parties in Canada, France, or England. The National Front, the AFD, and the Reform Party are far right parties. And I think because the politics in Europe has been far more liberal, considerably, and the cultures are far more liberal and secular than in the United States, a reactionary result of that is a more extreme response. So the Reform Party, the AFD, and the National Front in Great Britain, France, and Great Britain, Germany, and France, respectively, have all been far more radicalized compared to the conservative, Republican, or Libertarian parties, maybe in the United States or Canada. So Elon Musk is subsidizing the Reform Party because it's an isolationist party. It's libertarian in many of its pursuits, but it's more extreme than the Republicans in the United States because it's a reactionary party and it doesn't have a lot of support. And a lot of conservative thinking people in the United States think that the conservative parties in Canada and especially in Great Britain have been worthless center left parties that have done nothing and are no good for those countries. They aren't really conservative, they're conservative in name only. So people who have on the right in this country find more in sympathy with the AFD in Germany or the Reform Party in Great Britain than they do with the Conservative Party in Great Britain or the Conservative Party in Canada. Um, so I hope that answers your question, triglyceride. I don't know if I would call the Reform Party necessarily fascistic. I wouldn't call the National Front. I think fascist is bandied about. I did a video about this a while back. I think the term fascist is bandied about very easily. It's to the point where it doesn't mean anything, and it's usually just anyone who is on the right or even on the hard right is a fascist. And I don't know. You have to define what a fascist is and what a fascist does. And fascism, from what I understand, is an authoritarian government, anti-democratic, militaristic and nationalist government that seeks through military successes to promote the glory and chauvinism of their country over others. They are more isolationist, but they are also very obsessed with their national image and with countering any sort of internationalism. Um, so that's what I understand fascism as. And fascism obviously is invented in Italy by different philosophers, and Mussolini creates the first fascist government based on the fasci, which is a Roman symbol of a bundle of sticks held together, that they're stronger together with an axe at the top, representing the military might of the Roman Empire. So the fasci is an ancient Roman symbol that is revived by Mussolini to basically harken Italy back to its nationalist origins of the Roman Empire. And that's how it's been used. So we use that term flippantly to refer to right wingers. I don't think that's necessarily fair, and I think we need to define the terms a little bit better. It's too easy to use. Was Tsar Nicholas related to the English royal family line? Not technically, he was not, but well, it's kind of yes and no. There was a lot of intermarriage amongst the royals of Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and that led to people like Tsar Nicholas being cousins of Kaiser Wilhelm and George V of England. And his wife, Alex of Hesse, the Tsarina, was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria. Through one, Albert and Victoria had 9 children, and they intermarried with the Greek royal line, and the Swedish royal line, and the Russian royal line, and the German imperial line. And so you have a lot of intermarriage and political connections. And when the Tsar and the German Kaiser are getting ready to fight World War One, they're writing letters calling each other Nicky and Willie because they grew up together and they had been, chums. They were cousins. So yes, there was some relation between them. That's quite interesting. In fact, at when the Russian Revolution happened, the king, George V of England, wanted to bring the Tsar to Great Britain and allow him to live there in political exile and basically give him asylum. And Lloyd George, worrying that a communist revolution would spread, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, he determined that was not good. And so the Tsar was forced to stay in Russia, where the Bolsheviks eventually killed him. So yeah, there was some of that connection. Victoria's husband, a man named Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, was German, and the Hanoverian line itself, of which Victoria was part, stretched back to her great grandfather George I, who was brought over from Hanover in Germany to become the King of England in order to prevent a Catholic from rising to the imperial throne. Um, so. Yes, and King William is very British because there has been more and more weaning out of that line that's German and European and more English. And obviously, his mother, Diana Spencer, is very English. Um, Canada's the 51st state soon. I don't think that's going to happen. You might be making a joke, but I really don't see it happening with Topo, and I don't see it happening because it just doesn't make a lot of sense for Canada to become the 51st state. It would be a very difficult annexation process. Canada is too big to be one state. There would be a lot of economic debt and issues taken on by the United States. And it wouldn't be politically expedient for the Republicans and for Trump to annex Canada because Canada is far more liberal than the United States, and that would give the Democrats a lot more political power. So I don't see that happening anytime soon. I see this more as Trump using that as and Canada's current economic and social woes as a way to gain political clout and influence and basically get Prime Minister Trudeau, who is his supposed political enemy, to give him what he wants. So I think it's more a political tool. I think that's why he wants the Panama Canal. That's why he's talking about Denmark. He's worried about China and their activities in the Atlantic and Pacific and going through the Panama Canal. He's worried about Russia trying to militarize the Arctic, and so getting Greenland is a way to create an American base of operations in the Arctic. Basically, it's all, I think, political maneuvering. I don't know that it actually has any teeth in it, and I don't know that it's actually going to happen. Um, so does anyone know how they would end up being empowered to another country that is not their main background? Political maneuvering. That's basically what happens throughout most of European history. I mean, technically, if you want to think about it, the English line is French going back to William of Normandy, who conquered England in 1066. Um, Thank God we got Biden as henchman now. Time for a change. These young people can't define fascism. They talk like parrots. Yeah, there is a lot of parroting of that term fascist. And I would say of socialist or Marxist too. We think these words are bogeyman words where there actually is some teeth in what they mean that could be existentially dangerous, but people don't know what they actually are, so they can't define them. Speaking of President Biden, I did a video today about how President Biden, and I have an entire series on US presidents and on the US election if you want to go check that out. But President Biden, I talked about how President Biden is not the first U.S. president to pardon a relative. Obviously, he's gotten a lot of heat for pardoning his son, which any father would do anyways. Abraham Lincoln actually pardoned his sister-in-law, who his wife's half sister, her name was Amelia Todd, like Mary Todd, Amelia Todd Hale, whose husband, who was also from Kentucky, like Lincoln, had been a Confederate general, and she was charged with treason, as was her husband. Her husband died at the Battle of Chancellorsville, but she lived, and she was going to face charges. And Lincoln, in a show of unifying the country, not of nepotism, actually pardoned her in 1863, right after he pardoned the first Thanksgiving turkey, naming it Jack, by the way. But Biden is not the first president to do that. People think this is a far more politically motivated decision. Who knows? I don't see any good coming out of continual prosecution of the son of an American president, be they Republican or Democrat. And I think that Trump would have been wise to pardon him if Biden hadn't. I think the heat Biden is getting, and perhaps rightfully so, is that he did so after saying he wouldn't get involved in this and that his son needed to go through the judicial process. This only reinflates the idea used by Trump and his supporters that there is a two-tiered system of justice that would lead to Trump getting so heavily persecuted, apparently, through his New York cases and things like this, and leading to Hunter Biden getting off scot-free. And the interesting thing that a lot of people have pointed out is that it's a 10-year window. in which his son was pardoned, and that doesn't sound right because there might be some funny business before or since. Who knows? So I don't know enough about FEMA camps, triglyceride. I've heard some interesting things about them, though. Do you know anything about Blackroot, NVIDIA, Alphabet, and the AI connection? Julian, I'm not a huge expert on technology and the development of AI. I do know that a lot of these companies own huge amounts of land or basically marketing spaces. And I know that BlackRock, Vanguard, own each other basically and work together to create as much economic wealth and property ownership and investment opportunities for each other as possible. Um, there's a secret military base in Denver Airport. That's fascinating. Kim, interesting screen name. This is the Friendly Neighborhood History channel where we talk about different historical topics. People ask me anything in our live streams Fridays and Saturday nights. So if you like history, social studies, the humanities, and you want to ask me questions about that or talk about a particular topic, drop it in the chat. Consider liking and subscribing and becoming a friendly neighborhood historian. Triglyceride is asking, do you think homosexuality is created to make men easier to control? No. No, I don't. I don't think that it makes men easier to control. I don't think sexuality does that. Let me see here. Megalomaniacs are on steroids lately. I don't think megalomaniacs need steroids. Is tomorrow about the French Rev? Did you decide yet? I think it will be. I think I can talk about it in a shortened form and maybe talk about the history of Hanukkah. So I think I'm going to do 2 topics there and maybe a third one if I get the time. I like to do multiple topics because it interests people who are interested in different types of history and isn't just me droning on about one thing. But sometimes there's just so much to cover that it takes me the whole hour to talk about a topic. But tomorrow, 4 p.m. Eastern, our live stream lecture, which will one day willingly become the Friendly Neighborhood History Podcast. We will be discussing the French Revolution and the history of Hanukkah, hopefully both of those. Fellow Earthlings is asking, why is Elon Musk the president? I think this is because of I don't know that he's the president necessarily. He definitely has a lot of influence. For the longest time, it seems as though there are changing tides. For the longest time, most billionaires have supported liberal Democrats. I think Musk is a break from that and is very open and forthright about his support for Trump and his administration and how he wants to be a political mover and shaker and reshape the Republican Party. And I think that offends a lot of people. But those people aren't offended by the fact that Democrats like George Soros and others have had a huge amount of influence on liberal politics for the last 40 or 50 years. Musk is probably more brusque and in your face about it, and that's why it's so offensive. But I think a lot of people who are offended by it just don't like his politics, and that's why they're saying for him to stay in his lane. They weren't saying that about other billionaires who were interfering on behalf of the Democrats for decades before. Do you think these companies have control over the government? Julian, I think any company that has a lot of land, wealth, and power has a certain amount of political influence and control, and it's been this way for a long time. I've been talking about a lot about the British Empire. The British East India Company owned India for a long time and had such a huge amount of influence on the British economic system. They were basically allowed to do whatever they wanted until their human rights abuses basically forced the British to defrock them and take over India as a colony in 1858. Thank you, C-Dub. I appreciate that. Google would definitely be part of that, and they're part of the tech side of that. 4 p.m. Eastern. That's when we'll be there. Yeah. Yeah, fellow Earthlings, I think there's megalomaniacs everywhere, and I think anybody who is a billionaire or is able to amass that amount of wealth or power for him or herself has a level of narcissism that they've used to their advantage in a productive capacity. You look at any billionaire in any part of history, they're going to have some narcissistic tendencies. Rockefeller certainly had this. Carnegie had this. Some of the most sociopathic people, some of the worst sociopaths in the world are not serial killers or mass murderers. They are CEOs or CFOs in Fortune 500 companies because they are cutthroats to get to the top. C-Dub is saying, I find it hard to wrap my head around how the British Empire was so powerful coming from the island. Because, again, their preoccupation for centuries was with building a navy to defend themselves from the French, the Germans, and the Spanish. And the creation of that navy, starting with Henry VIII, was a way to shore up the domestic defense of the British, and that navy carried them through time and time again. It kept them from being invaded by Napoleon in the 1800s. It allowed them to protect their trade interests. It allowed them to both trade for slaves and to fight the slave trade from one century to another. In the 1700s, they were buying slaves from Africa and using their navy to defend the slave ships. Then they were using their navy to destroy slave ships in the 1800s after they outlawed slavery, interestingly enough. It's basically just they had the fastest and best and largest amount of ships, and it wasn't that they had millions of them, but they had enough of them, and they had a substantial amount more than the other navies. And it wasn't until the late 19th century that other countries like Germany, which could produce a lot, and the United States started to catch up. The British Navy was their biggest advantage because they had had centuries to hone and develop it, starting in the 1500s. And they are the first industrialized society too. It's the AI companies that has control of sniper drones. That's interesting. I'll have to look into that. I don't know enough about that, Julian, to say more. When I don't know something, I don't say anything about it, but I take your word for it, and I appreciate what you're asking and talking about. And this is what we do here. We go from geopolitics, past and present, because all history is connected, and then we jump into the history 400 or 500 years ago. The ability to bounce around from topic to topic is something that I really, really enjoy. It's how I bring hopefully relevant and interesting news to all of you. And if you have enjoyed what we have talked about today, please feel free to like and subscribe and join us tomorrow for the live stream lecture. We're going to wrap it up here. We've been going for an hour. I apologize for such a late start, but we definitely made up for it in time with some really great questions and some contributions from new and old faces, which I always really enjoy. I will take one more question, our last call, but if not, feel free to have a great evening and join us tomorrow. Like and subscribe. Tell all your friends and family. Check out that long and short form content on the channel. Really looking forward to tomorrow's live stream lecture. C-Dub, thank you so much for the topic. And fellow Earthlings, what you just said when you mentioned powerful CEOs remind me of a business that gets filthy rich from people's chronic conditions. Well, yeah, that's in the news a lot right now because basically, if you basically taking care of people can be a lucrative business because there's always going to be a high demand for people to have their medical needs taken care of, and there will always be an old population that will need their medical needs attended to. And as the population gets older and unhealthier due to all sorts of different issues, chronic diseases, bad diet, I mean the obesity crisis is only growing and getting worse in the Western world. The medical companies, the insurance companies will benefit from this because they will have the continual need to actually take care of these people, and they'll be racking in lots and lots of dough. So yeah, you make a good point, fellow Earthlings. I appreciate. I know it's sounds a little cynical, and I know that many people in these insurance companies and medical companies and pharmaceutical companies are doing everything in their power to help people live good, natural lives and die in a proper way with as little pain as possible. But there is a lot of hand meshing together and greed that motivates these things. And there is always a market for a service that is needed. And one of those services is taking care of people when they are sick, chronically ill, or dying. So yeah, fellow Earthlings, thank you for your questions. Thank you for joining us. Pure Water, it's my pleasure. Great to have. I will miss you, Simon, but Rodolfo will be holding down the fort, and be sure to watch it and check it out afterwards. Simon, I look forward to your comments there, and thank you for moderating. Guys, before you leave, make sure to show some love to Simon the Bunny. He's the greatest moderator in the entire world who really makes this channel work and run better than I do, and I really appreciate him and all of his commentary and help here. But have a great night, everybody. Take care, like, subscribe, and we'll see you tomorrow for the live stream lecture where we will be talking about the French Revolution and Hanukkah, two very interesting juxtaposed topics, but I can thank C-Dub for giving them to me. Take care and have a great night, everybody. Well, and Simon, I wish I had your patience to deal with me when I'm always so late. So thank you. That's very sweet of you to say that. Should we all have $1.8 billion? No, because if we all had $1.8 billion, Julian, then $1.8 billion wouldn't have any value anymore. Whenever people have a lot of something, it doesn't have value. It's just how things work. That's how you get hyper instant inflation, giving everybody a bunch of billions of dollars. But anyways, all right. Looking forward to tomorrow's live stream. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining. Consider liking and subscribing, becoming a friendly neighborhood historian. Show Simon some love. Follow me on those social media handles. And I will see you guys tomorrow. Really looking forward to it. Have a great rest of your Saturday. Take care. Bye-bye.